What's up guys, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be painting the Lord of Poxes. He's a pretty unique Death Guard model because he doesn't have any horns or tentacles or anything like that. There's only two main areas to focus on outside of his weapons, that being his armor and his cloak. So I thought that painting this guy would be a good opportunity to focus in on the basics. So for the main sections on this model, I just did a base coat, shade, and highlight, and that's pretty much it. Let's get into it. For the base coat, I kept it really simple. I just used straight up Death Guard green with a wet dry brush. Now I put water on the tips of the bristles of the dry brush and pretty much soaked the Death Guard green onto the dry brush. And then I just pushed this onto the model. This base coating step only took me about 1 minute to complete, and I did 2 coats. So this is a really effective way to base coat armor on models if you don't have a dry brush. Another pro of this is that just because of the nature of this technique, the deepest recesses are actually left black, which helps during the shading process. For the cloak, I'm just using a medium gray. I just used white and black here and mixed it pretty much equally to get this color. And then I just applied this using a base coat consistency over all of the cloth areas. Now, the thought process for choosing these colors for me was really that I wanted to pick a color that had place to go. So for example, like if I put in a really dark color, then I would have no room to place my shadows. And if I base coated a really bright color, I wouldn't really have a lot of room to place my highlights. So that's why I'm picking these mid-tone colors. Now, for other base coats, I went ahead and base coated the metallic section. So that includes the metal turbines and also the trim. As usual, I used Balthazar Gold for the trim, and this guy did not have that much trim. So that wrapped up step one. It was now time to move on to step two, which is to shade. And I'm going to focus on the armor first. So I'm going to be using a dark, very, very dark purple as a shade. Basically something that's almost black, but that's not quite black, because I thought that using just plain black for my shadow would be a little bit uninteresting. So I decided to add a little bit of purple in it just to make the shadow a little bit purpley. A very important part of this step is to water down your paint and then roll off excess moisture off of the tip of your brush. You have to do this before you start glazing, or else your paint is either going to be too watery or it's not going to be watered down enough and it'll just have too strong coverage. I'm focusing in here on any part of the model where I think should have a shadow. So I'm imagining the light hitting him from the front. So I think the areas are around the edges of the chest plate, the edges of his shins. Like these are the sections that are going to have these dark shadows. What you'll notice is that my first layer is pretty thin, so it's not actually that dark, but this is good because it gives me an opportunity to add additional layers where I think the shadow should be the darkest. And one more thing, when I'm painting these glazes, I'm always pushing the pigments of the paint towards the section I want to be the darkest. At this point, I was pretty happy with the shadows on the armor, so I decided to go to the next color, which is just using plain old Death Guard green at a glaze consistency to smooth the transition between the dark area and the regular Death Guard green area. For this step, it's very similar to the previous step, except I'm using Death Guard green. Remember, I'm loading up my brush with pretty watered down paint and then rolling the tip of the brush on the paper towel. And then all of my brush strokes are going towards the section I want to be the most Death Guard green. So I'm starting in the shadow and pushing towards the center of the model in this case. With the shadows done, it is now time for step three, which would be the highlights. And I added 2 highlight layers. The first was a glaze of yellow green. I got this by mixing lemon yellow and Death Guard green to create this nice toxic green color. And then I applied this the same way that I did previously, but what you'll see here is that I'm actually pushing the pigments towards the very center of the model, and I'm actually not starting this glaze in the shadow. And that's because I want these areas to be focused areas of brightness. For the final highlight, I wanted something a little bit stronger, so I took a very bright skin tone color and mixed it in with my Death Guard green to create this pallid green color. I then took that color and then used this to edge highlight the model. So you can see here I'm focusing on all of the edges on the model. And then I also applied this in a glaze consistency in the very center of the model. Basically, this would be the spot on the armor that would be reflecting the light at its peak. So the center of his chest, like the peaks of his shoulders, the tops of his head, etc. So this was a fun step. This is really where the armor started to pop for me. And all in all, this whole shading and highlighting process did not actually take that much time because he didn't have too much armor, which is a pro. And this is where I ended up at the end. Now, keep in mind with this method, you can always go back and darken your shadows or brighten your highlights. So when you're going through this process, I found that I could always just take a step back, observe the model, and figure out where I want to adjust it, and then just go in with my color and adjust it. With the armor knocked out, I repeated the same process on the cloak. So I have my base coat already done. That's the medium gray. Then I went in, added my shade, and then I highlighted. I think applying the shadow in the cloak is a little bit more challenging than the armor because it has a lot of complex shapes. But when I was looking at the cloak, what I did is I just basically put shadows under every overhang in the cloak, and that's kind of how I identified where the shadows should be. I stuck by this method and I thought it turned out pretty decent. After getting the shadows in, the next thing to do was to do the highlight, and I just brightened up my gray color to a little bit brighter gray color, and then used this to highlight all the raised sections on the cloak. Cloaks are really fun to use glazing on because they have these wide, flat surfaces, so this was really good practice, I think. Moving up in color again, this time I just focused on the peak raised sections on the cloak. At this point, the highlights and the shadows looked pretty good, but I thought that the gray was a little boring. So what I did is I took brown and purple, mixed those together, and I watered it down significantly. This basically created this very dark purpley brown glaze. And then I added this into all of the shadows on the cloak. This basically took the color from this dark gray color to this more interesting purple brown color. Applying that glaze dulled down some of my highlights. So I went back and just re-highlighted all the edges on the cloak. And this was pretty much the final step for me on the cloak. Before moving on to the rest of the model, I went back and added in another layer of highlights on my armor just to brighten up those areas a bit. This was to make the shine on the armor a little bit brighter than the cloak, or at least that was the intention. For the Plague Sword, I wanted to do a toxic green glow, and I used this color range to do that. I started by mixing my darkest green with black to create this very dark green color. I watered that down and then dabbed this on the sword in random sections to create these really dark green splotches. Then I basically went up my color palette, and with each brighter color, I dabbed the paint on in smaller and smaller areas within these blotches. It was a pretty simple step, but I think it creates a nice effect, especially for a plague sword. The only thing that I would change here is that I think I might go back and add some rust on the sword just to make it look a little bit more Nurgle versus just having this nice green glow effect. For the plasma, I pretty much used regular paints, but I did have one trick up my sleeve for this. So I started by using Baroth Blue, which is a very, very bright blue color, and I used that to base coat the coils on the gun. From there, I mixed in regular blue with my Baroth Blue to create a slightly darker blue, and then I used this to dry brush the area around the coils. And the reason why I'm using a slightly darker blue than just plain Baroth Blue is because the glow coming from the light source should be darker than the actual light source. To establish the brightest area on the plasma coils, I needed to use white, but in order to get the white to flow into all of the crevices between the coils, I mixed pure white with flow improver. And this basically makes the paint a little bit flowy so that it allows it to get into all the cracks and create this nice white effect on the plasma. The final step was to add a light dry brush of that same blue color that I used earlier. With that, my Lord of Poxes is finally done, aside from the base, which I will paint at a later time. I think the Lord of Poxes is a really interesting Death Guard model. He's an HQ unit and he doesn't have a Nurgling companion. His armor is mostly intact as well. He doesn't have protruding tentacles, horns, or anything like that either. All of that combined with his open pose makes painting this guy a very pleasant painting experience. There's not too many separate things to focus on, so you can really hone in on getting the shadows and the highlights correct, which is kind of what I tried to do on this model. Let me know what you guys think about this guy. I think he's a really cool addition to any Death Guard collector's army. If you like the video, like and subscribe, and I will catch you in the next one.